Thanks, Chair. Food regulation bill is on. It's not a great time that the two things are on together. First of all, you're welcome. In your opinions, say the war was on last year. We heard straight away that certain things couldn't come out from Russia. Certain, say, the ingredients for making fertilizer. The war is still going on. But the fertilizer has come down. Has any of ye got any inside information on what is that reason that basically everyone was hearing that, be it oil going up, diesel went up, gas went up, but that the raw materials, to put it simply, were hard to get out of the certain places that we needed them, the volumes that we needed, and we seem to. It seems to be just that they're able to get them somewhere now, and gas, as you've pointed out, has come down. We know that, but where did the raw materials come out of that's making it all sort of, I think, less than half the price at the moment you can buy stuff for. In relation to, and John, I want to wish you luck, by the way, you were saying it was your last meeting, but in relation to a thing, or a statement you made there, I think you that said it, that you'd look for the committee to investigate. I'll be honest with you here, with a farmer in here, with, God rest him, Pádraig Walsh, in Kilkenny, along 6 or 8 months ago or longer, just before Christmas, and we have looked to see how we could help him, and we have been told very clearly on the legal side that we have no investigative power. So I don't think we should, I think we need to be honest with you and build it up straight to you, that unless a minister investigates, you know, we'll be ruled out of order, to be quite blunt about it, and there's no point in leading you up the garden path. In relation to fertiliser, in your opinion, and especially, say, around the country, what percentage, there was a lot of fertiliser bought in sort of at the back end of last year in places. In your opinion, what percentage was bought in? Second of all, or thirdly, there was a lot of raw materials were probably bought in more than a year ago or 18 months ago. And they were here, basically a lot of stocks, and the stuff wasn't bought. So, in your opinion, is the materials being used that was here in stock that wasn't used last year? And I suppose that raises a serious question of, were they inflated prices, or is someone taking a massive hit at the moment on the gear, on the prices that's shown? It's interesting to see as well, there is fertiliser coming across the border, or coming across, say, coming from different parts. I think they've put some stipulation, have the department, on farmers that nearly makes you like an importer if you go to bring it in. I want to know your views on that. Are farmers aware that there are certain fertilizers coming out of certain parts that don't have the same? You could buy, was it 18,612 in one part of the country and buy it in another part of the country, that it may not have the same makeup, even though it might be wrote on the bag. Are farmers aware of that? And in relation to the lime, and you talked about it, Dan, earlier on, my understanding on the lime is that 2 weeks before it closed, it was oversubscribed. My understanding, because I talked to people in the department, that what they were doing was they weren't going to reduce the price, but they were going to reduce the tonnage per farmer, is my understanding. Maybe, and I'm open to correction on that. And I think that, like, off the top of my head, something like 8 million of a budget was what was given. Like, it wouldn't, with the amount of money that's there at the moment, for, say, with the country having 8 or 10 billion extra, I'm sure another 7 or 8 million wouldn't be hard to root out to make sure that people are covered on the lime. In your opinion, what sort of a budget is required yearly for, I know you can only throw on 2 tonne at a time to be prudent, and if you do it for a few years you bring up the pH of the soil, but what sort of a budget in your opinion would be required to give basically a proper liming programme to the farmers out there? Thank you.
See, there's a questions there. So, Mr. Rush.
Thanks, Chairman. I suppose the first question is that do we have any inside information in terms of the fertiliser market? And like a lot of farmers, I would have bought fertiliser back end, and if I had that inside information, I wouldn't have bought any. Putting it quite simple. And a lot of farmers did buy it last back end, and they bought it because they were fearful of supply, and they played up with 2 risks in their head. So the risk was obviously that price could come back, but the other risk was that they wouldn't be able to get it. And the decision a lot of farmers made was, well, I think the risk of not getting it is a greater risk. So I secured in my yard, and I'll have it anyways. And knowing, like, the soundings coming from the industry was that the price wasn't going to move much at all, and that's where it was. And I suppose you're quite right in terms of when the war started and what happened. We had the big impact on input prices fairly quickly, and farmers were fearful in terms of would they get it. They weren't getting the product they wanted. Would they get it? And this was, farmers talking to themselves, and even sounders coming from the sector as well. So farmers entered the market, they secured what product they had because of the fear of not having it. In what is it, and that was, we remember the setting up of the fodder committee, and even the tillage incentive scheme to try to secure feed. But if you look at what happened was, farmers, by buying all that fertiliser, farmers carried the risk for the sector. That's what happened there. So the industry wasn't going to buy fertiliser and leave it sitting in yards and take the risk themselves. They said to farmers, or the noises came out to farmers, that if you want to guarantee fertiliser for next year, you're going to have to buy it and take delivery. So farmers took the risk for the sector, and now farmers are paying for that risk. And I think John Keane mentioned there, and he was quite right, that in the interest of fairness, there should really have been a kind of a burden share around that, because to be quite clear, farmers are shouldering the complete burden of that now straight away. You asked for an opinion about how much fertiliser was secured by farmers back end. I think that was one of your questions. And the answer to that, Deputy, is I do not know. Only that, anecdotally, talking to other farmers, talking to our members, talking to farmers, even in my discussion group, that a lot of farmers, particularly in the dairy sector and tillage sector, would have went out and secured fertiliser, and a lot of fertiliser last back end has been sitting in yards. And that's only been used now. And it's probably, I'm not sure of the statistics now in terms of what's been bought this spring, but I would imagine it's down quite a lot, and it's only down because it was all bought last back end. You have a question there in terms of the liming scheme, like in opinion, what sort of a budget would you think? And it's not to put a figure on it, but I think, if you wanted a national liming scheme, in terms of, I think it should be, open to all farmers. It's my understanding now it's closed off to derogation farmers. Correct. So it shouldn't be closed off to derogation farmers. Should be open to all farmers, and the money won't be massive. You quite rightly recognise where the state finds itself in. So it should be open-ended, to be honest with you. Like, farmers aren't going to spread. You could come away and limit, like what you said, a 2 tonne per hectare, 2 tonne per acre max. Because beyond that, you're only doing harm. So, backed up with soil samples, most recent soil analysis, I think it would have been a simple way of doing it. There's another couple of points there I might pass on to Max and Carol. But thank you for your question, Deputy.
Yeah, thank you for your question, Deputy. Yeah, I can just come in on the fertiliser register question. So farmers who import or bring fertiliser from Northern Ireland do have to register as a fertiliser economic operator. At the last JOC hearing on the veterinary medicine.
Explain, is there more red tape to that, to put it simple?
Well, there is simply, yes. Now, the registering on the database appears relatively simple. You tick a box. And I suppose in previous purchasing habits, there might have been relatively small amounts of farmers bringing it across the border. But there are obviously a significantly greater number this year due to reasons already discussed in terms of price. So we would be concerned that farmers may forget to do that or not register as economic operators and then subject to sanction or penalties as a result, which would be disappointing as well. So we would have concerns in that. In respect of different blends of nutrients, and it's not something I've been aware of really, I've come across at all, yeah. And then just on the tillage side.
There's different methodologies of bedding it up, and they're not the nitrogen part, but the P's and the K's.
Yeah, the P and K is just is that we quote everything in elemental. Towards in the UK, phosphorus and potassium are quoted different. It's potassium chloride and phosphorus pentoxide. I think it's expressed on the bag as well. Yeah. And then just finally on the tillage, I can just provide some anecdotal evidence pretty much from our National Grain Committee. Many farmers tillage farmers had purchased 30, 40, 50% of their fertiliser requirements for the harvest 23 in late 2022. This is now in a difficult position because that fertiliser was bought at the top of the market, but green grain prices for harvest 23 have declined by 30 to 40%, but the fertiliser is effectively at north of €800 a tonne. So if grain prices fall any further, margins could be extremely compromised and difficult and that. So it's important to note that point as well.
Ms. McCormick.
Yeah, thank you very much, Deputy Fitzmaurice, for your questions. You quite rightly alluded to the war in Russia and the availability of raw materials last year and the hysteria that was created around that. Obviously, we at that particular time, and indeed in the previous autumn, we had seen a very strong gas price, which was contributing to a slow but steady rise in the price of fertiliser in the autumn of 21. But right into February 22. And then we saw an escalation, I suppose. What percentage of fertiliser is bought? I would say on farm for the majority of the year, somewhere around 15–20% if you go across. Now, various farmers have various levels of exposure there. All I can say is I was at an advisory meeting of a local co-op last week, and the sales to the end of March were at a third of where they were last year. That's probably a two-stool approach or a twin-tower approach, where in March last year there was a hysteria and every bit of fertiliser that could be bought, there was a tractor and trailer sent to town for it. Whereas this year there's a major standoff as we await reality as regards the price of fertiliser. You talked about old materials and co-ops and fertiliser manufacturers having old materials. I suppose what we did see in 2022, was some large fertiliser sales groupings shut their book for orders on a Tuesday, and by the following Monday they were gone up 150 to 250 to 300 euros with no fertiliser deliveries taken in that period of time. So there was money made out of fertiliser that was bought fairly right in the autumn of 21 and into the spring of 22. There was money made there in the March-April period. You talked about, and I know it was alluded to by my colleagues here to our right, the various different labelling and measuring methods for P and K in various other jurisdictions. But if there is mislabelling within this jurisdiction, I think it needs to be brought to task. And I'd encourage the Minister and indeed all those responsible for farmers getting what they order and what they require under a certain label to be there, because that would be a serious breach of trust and commercial trading.
Anything else I'd like to on that is that, in fairness, if you were importing fertiliser from somewhere else, they would have complied with their system of doing it. but it's just that farmers needs to know that there may be a difference. It's not that I'm not saying, and I would never say that someone is mislabeling something, but just that the farmers needs to be aware that on nitrogen you could be 100% perfect sound on the nitrogen part, but on the P's and K's, that it's the system that's used and it's fully above board in the countries that it's being used, but just that people need to be aware of it.
Yeah, and I suppose to touch on the fertiliser register, it is a huge level of burden and responsibility for farmers into the future. I mean, they talk about a closing inventory on the 15th of September and fertiliser on farm. And, without the best predictions in the world, if Daisy, the old cow, happens to die on the 16th, you may find yourself overusing fertiliser between that and the end of December, even though you spread no chemical fertiliser, purely as a result of the demand out there on farm. But, I suppose to your point on the importation of fertiliser, I think it's anti-competitive, and it, I suppose, does everything possible to add bureaucracy and reduce the chances of a farmer going across the border to bring in fertiliser at a right price, which we can see in 2023 could be substantially less than what was available here in the January, February, March period.
I say.
I suppose just the first thing to say is that the war last year, I mean, the first thing I would say is that it shows the need for more transparency and the need for the Minister to be more proactive in investigating this whole market. In practice, I think some of what happened, there's maybe two schools of thought. Obviously, Russia is a player in fertiliser at a global level. It's the second biggest in terms of fertiliser production. It is very significant player in potash and in ammonia, which is needed for the manufacture of fertiliser in Europe. But on the other hand, it's true to say as well that there are lots of places you can get fertiliser. It's manufactured in Europe. A lot of urea is brought out of North Africa. But what seems to have happened is that natural gas, there was a big panic in markets around natural gas as soon as this war kicked off. So you see natural gas started going up until it reached $9.75 in August 22. And some of the European manufacturers slowed down or limited production because the cost of the gas was so high, to protect, I suppose, their own costs of production. But somehow they managed to come out on the correct side, because we now hear, I saw recently, that the top 9 world fertiliser producers are in line for 57 billion in profit between them. So things are going well in the fertiliser sector if you're on the right side of this equation.
What figure did you use the other day?
57 billion. Top 9 world's, the world's top 9, it's in our document, top 9 fertiliser companies, 57 billion between them. And there are examples of other companies that are active here that have had very profitable years as well.
What was their general one?
That seems to be one of their highest ever. I can't give you a chapter and verse going back over the years, okay? So in other words, they managed the crisis. So when natural gas was at its peak, they just stopped production. That did impact availability of fertiliser, and that was an issue right across Europe and in the United States and South America. Everywhere in the world did have a problem with dear fertiliser, or every farmer in the world had a problem with dear fertiliser in 2022. Not every farmer in the world is having a problem with dear fertiliser in 2023. We still have been. And I think, like, this, there's an outside world tuned in here maybe to this, and people think this is just farmers again. This is actually about the cost of food and food security. And, and I mentioned earlier on that the Commission's reaction to this in 2022 was lethargic, to say the least, where there was a lot of talk about the need for, soil health and alternatives to fertiliser and all kind of, I suppose, green agenda kind of stuff, which is fine to a point. Like, every farmer, wants to use as little fertiliser as they can without sacrificing efficiencies. But that's why farmers want this lime subsidy. On the other hand, it doesn't make any sense for a country like Ireland, and in fact Ireland, with the potential to have the highest cereal yield crops almost anywhere in the world, all things going well, weather and all of that, and with the potential to grow grass better than a lot of other countries, we have a vested interest in optimising our competitive advantage in that, and that is dependent on fertiliser being available to Irish farmers at a competitive, price compared to other farmers in Europe or elsewhere in the world. So this is serious business, and we can talk all we want about the switch to organic farming. That's a piece of, that is obviously part of the agenda, and that's fine. But the reality is we also have to have regard for food security and what the impact can be on the price of food to consumers. So this is a consumer issue as well. And Sri Lanka gave an example of that when they thought they didn't need fertiliser, right? So I think that all of these things have to be balanced. Just in terms of fertiliser register, I think, look at its additional burden on farmers, and it speaks to what I said earlier. When we want to have more scrutiny and more regulation of farmers, we seem to find a way. But the scrutiny at the other end of the food chain or the supply chain or the input chain is never quite as easy, and that's a huge frustration to farmers.
John?
Thanks, Chairman. Thanks, Deputy Fitzmaurice, for the questions. I suppose the first element was in terms of the availability for Russia and stopping overnight and the cost incurred, but now we're able to source it. I should say that I sit on the National Fodder and Food Security Committee, and some of the information that came from us was in terms of sourcing suppliers after the limited availability of Russian supplies last year. So the information that we would have had is that we had to move the fertiliser, people sorting fertiliser for Ireland had to move from their traditional supply routes to supply routes from Asia to North Africa. And obviously if you're not a player in those markets traditionally, or if you have no loyalty built up in those markets and you're coming in fairly new, we're a small import nation in reality in the grand scheme of things, you're not going to be the first boatload that gets delivered to the country. So that's the information that we were given to say that that's why we had a scarcity, whether you want to call it that. That's why we had an increase, and that's why we have the availability now. Is they've got to those markets, the boatloads are being filled, and we have access into those areas in North Africa and in Asia as well. In terms of the, I accept the point then around the committee and their inability to investigate. So that's absolutely fair enough. In terms of the bought-in fertiliser purchases, also as part of that National Fodder and Food Security, and I'm working off the top of my head on this because I didn't bring my diary with me on the walk today, but I can supply it afterwards, Chairman, if you want. Our understanding is that in Q1 of 2023's fertiliser year, which is October, November and December of 2022, that's the first quarter of this fertiliser year, there was a 25% increase on the fertiliser purchased, but that quarter only represents 4% of the annual sales. So not a huge amount of volume of fertiliser was purchased for the annual amount for years gone by. We do understand then that in the early part of the CSO data has to be compiled, and that committee has asked for that. But anecdotally from farmers in January, we do understand that there was a significant increase in the early part of January, and we've been told then by the fertiliser companies that pretty much from the middle of February onwards, until a number of weeks ago, the amount of fertiliser being purchased was almost nil. You asked the question then about in terms of the different types of fertiliser available in bags. We have heard the same as well. We've been told it's not necessarily a labelling issue, more so the different standards that are applied in different regions where fertiliser is manufactured, and we understand that that's a particular legislative requirement in some of the new markets that we're after accessing in the last number of years, or since the war in the Ukraine, and that I don't think it's anybody's particular fault. It's just a communication issue that's there as well. And traditionally farmers, 18,612 in the bag, I think there's a piece that needs to be done there in terms of communication. The last piece then in terms of the liming programme, the oversubscription, we're told as well that there is an oversubscription. And I suppose if you look at the scheme, €8 million assigned, stated it would support 500,000 tonnes of lime. I think that's €16 a tonne. If you look to the Teagasc annual soil sample results from 2022, it says that 39% of the soil samples that were taken were lower than 6.5 pH for lime requirement. So if you're bringing that soil pH back up, you're going to be putting on 2 tonnes to the acre. There's whatever 4 million hectares in the country. If you take that 39% of 4 million hectares odd, if you take out the commonage, you get to almost 4 million. 39% of those gives you 1.5 million hectares of ground. And if you're putting on 5 tonnes a hectare, it's 3 million tonnes. So 6 times what's currently assigned for €16 a tonne. That's I think that's all the questions we have, Deputy.
Mr. Roddy?
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah,
no, thanks, Deputy Fitzmaurice. Some good questions there. Look, some have been covered, and I know especially as regards where the problem as regards the supply of fertiliser with Russia, and that's so I don't know if there's anything I can add specifically to those. But I think there's a question there, Deputy, you asked. I mean, if prices were inflated, or has someone taken a massive hit? And it would be our view that farmers have continuously taken the hit. Now, you know, and definitely in 2023, that is the case. So I think if there is a hit, and maybe that's why we do need to look at an investigation into this. I'm not saying that the committee themselves would be in a position to do that, but I think we should look at the Competition Authority or something like that, or maybe, as you said yourself, Minister himself can drive that investigation. Just as regards the fertiliser coming in from Northern Ireland and elsewhere, you're right. There is a problem. I won't say it's a problem, as John has alluded to, it's the labelling. And obviously it's compliant with labelling in the country of origin with their requirements. But specifically, our understanding is this is around the P's and K's. I think the nitrogen is as is, but I think we're looking at lower P and K, as I understand it, than what we would see here. So for 8612, we're looking at obviously the 18 would be okay, but the 6 and the 12 would be lower. So that's clearly something the farmers do need to consider when they're buying. Just as regards the fertiliser coming in from Northern Ireland and the requirement for that register, that yeah, they do need that database to register on a database. And look, if that's the requirement, to better, you know, if so long as it's not a deterrent to the farmers and to those that are bringing it in. And I think if there are farmers that have, for some reason, forgotten, then I think, you know, you would hope that, you know, that there won't be a hard hit for those farmers, and maybe yellow card or warning might be more appropriate than come down with a very hard hit on that. Just the other point, Deputy, I know I think we would just, on a general point as regards fertiliser, I think we can't underestimate this idea that, you know, this talking up, I think, and how genuine it was. I'm sure on some levels it was genuine, but in other levels, I think it was definitely talked up, that fear of supply, and that's definitely drove price and it's drove a panic. And I think farmers, as we outlined in our own document, I think farmers at this stage will be more inclined to not buy fertiliser than potentially and take a chance on it coming down than to go out there and still buy expensive fertiliser. And that obviously is going to have major, you know, a concern would be that would have problems as regards a further shortage next winter. Now, let's hope not, but the time and season is getting tighter at this stage. Just on the fertiliser register, I think the overall register, and I know Senator Boylan asked that, I think, earlier on. Our understanding as well is though this is the new ECA scheme, there's a measure in that, so that the fertiliser register is going to be required under that. I'm not saying we're happy about that, but definitely I think that will be a requirement. And maybe then just on the liming, if it's okay, I might pass on to my colleague Tomas too from Galway, and he might just have a quick comment on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Deputy. Yeah, just the only point I want to make regarding the liming is obviously the Department of Agriculture sent out guys there a couple of years ago to do a nationwide soil sampling, and it was obviously the results came back from that. All the farmers got a very good detailed report, and one of the main things about it obviously was pH was low, and it has been mentioned before nationwide that it's, you know, a lot of farms were down below 6.5. So with regards to budget on the liming, I just don't think that there should be a budget, because really every farmer is restricted how much they can put out per acre. Otherwise there's no value in it. So as as mentioned before, it's about 2 to 3 tonne per acre. So if any genuine farmer was going to put out amount of lime, he only can put out that amount to the acre. And with obviously the push to moving into organics again as well, is one of the things that you can put out in organics is lime. And a lot of farmers have moved over to organics in the last couple of years with the incentives that are there, which hopefully would help that you're allowed to put out lime. And of course, now that the actual liming program is oversubscribed, that's going to have an effect on those farmers that have joined. Like myself on the ground here, I put in for the liming budget, the liming scheme, and obviously I don't think I'm going to get the amount of lime that I put in myself. So that's all I wanted to put forward. Thank you.